We're so pleased that you can join us for today's program. My name is Kirsten Daca from California Humanities, and today's event is Civic Participation and California Immigrants. It's the penultimate program for our series, California on the Ballot, and we're delighted to be joined today by our guests, Sonia Diaz, Cynthia Buiza, and Hiroshi Motomura. I'll just say a few words about the series, and then I'll give the floor over to Sonia, who is doing us the kindness of moderating today. If you're not familiar with California Humanities, we are an independent nonprofit and a partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities since its founding in 1975. We're a grant maker who supports humanities projects throughout the state and every congressional district. We also fund and produce programs of our own, and to date we've awarded about $40 million in grants across the state. Today's series is California on the Ballot. It's a free series of online conversations that are inspired by civic questions in California life. We reflect on what civic engagement looks like in California, but also look back through state history and ask what changes might soon be in store, what policy is currently on the desks of our legislators, where are things headed. So just to lead us into the conversation, I think our framework here is if the American Republic is a political experiment, California might be its most visible laboratory. Our state's variety of cultures is at a high rate these days. It's 27% of Californians who are foreign-born. That's about 1 in 4, and many more have at least one foreign-born parent. So with that in mind, we'd like to talk about civic participation for this ever-growing contingent of California residents. We'd love to hear from you during this session. If you have questions for the panel, you can put them in the Q&A at any time, and then Sonia will start taking them at about 20 minutes till 5. Lastly, we'll just introduce Sonia, and then I'll leave you to this conversation. So Sonia Diaz is a practicing civil rights attorney and policy advisor who is also the founding director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute. Sonia co-founded the first multi-issue policy think tank focused on Latinos in the University of California system. Prior to this work, Diaz served as a policy counsel to Senator Kamala Harris during her first and second terms in California, and she also managed policy and legal issues of statewide importance, including topics relevant to today, civil rights, and immigration. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you to California Humanities for continuing to provide the nuance and the complexities for social issues today. I think we can learn so much from the past as it's informing our very complex present, but also as we continue some sort of optimism about a future of inclusive and equitable democratic representation for communities all too often overlooked. I am joined today by Professor Hiroshi Motomura, who is the co-faculty director of UCLA Center on Immigration Policy and also on faculty at the UCLA School of Law, an expert on immigration and citizenship. I'm also joined today by Cynthia Buiza, who is the executive director of the California Immigrant Policy Center, an organization that's championing immigrant inclusion and also immigrant exceptionalism in driving forward 21st century solutions. When I'm thinking about this conversation and we were approached by California Humanities, I was fresh off of some conversations with an immigration sociologist, Dr. Cecilia Menjivar. This last week was the American Sociological Association's big conference, right? Thousands of people. And Dr. Menjivar, as president of ASA, presented an hour lecture. The topical area was really around categories, and it stuck with me as it relates to electoral life, civic engagement, and voting. Categories are important because categories also determine the different contours of immigration. What I want to bring from Dr. Menjivar's research and her theoretical approach is that there's a multitude of categories, those created by the state and by government, those created by community, then adopted by government through a variety of pressures, and then those that have yet to be fully articulated, but really limit who can serve, who can run for political office, and who can cast a ballot. And so with that, when we're talking about voting, I think it's not as simple as someone being a citizen or not, because there have always been categories. And so tailoring this to the idea of electoral participation is really important. Our Constitution and amendments to the Constitution have enumerated who can vote, when they can vote, and where they can vote, and on what. Who can run based on where they were born for what offices. And so as it relates to casting a ballot, one may recall that the age was not always the age of 18 as when someone is able to engage in the franchise. This came through social movements and the anti-war protest against Vietnam, where if people were being sent off to die, that they should be able to have a stake in their democracy and their electoral representatives. Now, similarly, as it relates to communities of color, we know that the franchise was limited based on racial ethnic categories and gender identities. We also know that there were amendments to the Constitution that enumerated when people could come into the franchise, including something called Reconstruction that then went away and gave way to Juan Crow and Jim Crow. And so what I'm getting at is that this is not a permanent fixture about who can vote and who can't. It's always changing. The Brennan Center out of NYU in 2021 noted that there were 400 bills introduced in legislatures across the country to restrict access to the ballot. These are changes. Now, as it relates to our topic, immigrants, and this is not a monolithic group. This is a group from different racial ethnic groups, but also in different concentrations. That again is a category under the law as it pertains to voting. And so what I want to talk about is the ways in which immigrants have been able to engage in the electoral franchise and how they engage civically and what we've seen in the past. So Cynthia, if you could speak to that with mention of language access, I think that that would be really helpful for the audience.
Thank you, Sonia, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to California Humanities for inviting us in this very important and timely conversation. I really appreciate that we are having this conversation about making the connection between civic participation and social change. And I just want to speak a little bit to some historical points where which hopefully would lead us to a 21st century conversation on how we can have a more expansive notion of civic participation. As many of you know, and scholars of immigration, by the 1990s, many undocumented immigrants who have been able to attain legal status as a result of IRCA were eligible or became eligible for citizenship and or to vote. Additionally, during period before that, many refugees who became eligible for citizenship and their children under the Refugee Act also were able to begin to participate civically. While naturalization is a pathway that immigrants could take to become eligible voters and be engaged, there are also many ways in which immigrants could be engaged. For example, in Los Angeles, many immigrants, people coming from mixed status families and undocumented immigrants participate in various activities and events such as rallies, campaigns, registering eligible voters through Get Out the Vote drives. In addition, undocumented immigrants especially have also supported candidates and legislation that aims to advance the needs of the undocumented community, as well as their families. I emphasize two things here. One is that there are mixed status families, and in there you have immigrant voters as well as undocumented immigrant family members. I like to cite as well the example that my organization does every year, the Immigrant Day of Action that we conduct in Sacramento every spring, where we mobilize immigrant communities and really invite them to engage in political participation by not only educating but lobbying the legislature on issues that have great impact in their lives. In the past years, immigrant communities have become active participants in advocating for themselves and their families through participating in political speech, attending demonstrations, political meetings, and meetings with elected officials. Examples of models where this can be more specifically illustrated is new San Francisco law, which voters passed in 2016 as Proposition N, which gave certain non-citizens, including those without legal status, the right to vote in school board elections. In total, about 65 non-citizens registered to vote in the school district election, and of those who registered, 59 voted by either mail at City Hall or at local polling station. The state's efforts to build on policies like SB 225 also is included, and this was signed in 2019, which removed the citizenship requirement for state board and commission appointments, expanding the pool of eligible individuals. And the last example I will cite is in Santa Ana City, where in March 2021, they passed a new law that allows residents of the city, regardless of immigration status, to serve on any of the city's 10 boards and committees, as well as commissions. In fact, one of my friends, who is an undocumented young person, already serves in one of these commissions. So increasing immigrant representations in institutions would ensure that immigrants have a seat at the table. And as Sonia pointed out, the notion of civic participation has evolved. And if we look back in history, this isn't the first time that immigrants or undocumented populations have been allowed to engage in the electoral process. And I can say that a little later, but I want to pause there in case Hiroshi wants to chime in.
Hiroshi, you shared before we started a personal professional experience on the subject, on language access. Can you talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the electoral opportunity of immigrants, and then also what some of the limitations continue to be under these categories?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you, California Humanities, for inviting us. As Cynthia said, this is a super important conversation. And the question, Sonia, you're asking is an important piece of this. I mean, I think one of the things that we're talking about here are barriers to access, barriers to voting, and certainly language is for many people a potential significant barrier. But maybe the better way, or I can try to answer your question, Sonia, this way: that we're focusing now on voting. I mean, that's been the core of this conversation, but what I'm about to say may overlap a little bit with where Cynthia started, but voting is just one aspect of civic participation. As she points out, you can be politically active without being eligible to vote, and there's certainly many people eligible to vote who are not politically active, and so they're related, but they're not necessarily the same. And in turn, voting is part of civic participation. Civic participation is one aspect of belonging to society. In different ways. It could be in civic participation. It could be in economic contribution. There's just so many different things. So I just want to put that out there as far as context goes. And then, really to get to, Sonia, more specifically the question you raised, a lot of the history of voting and more generally civic participation has been the history of various kinds of inclusion and exclusion. And a lot of that history, and this has been true certainly in the United States, certainly in California, and in many respects around the world, it's a story of racial and ethnic exclusion. To a significant extent, it's also a story of racial and ethnic inclusion. And so it's also one that over time has involved gender and certainly involved class in terms of poll taxes or voting being restricted by gender for a very long time. So then it gets around to your question about different ways that civic participation can be a side of exclusion. And one of the significant ones here is barriers to voting. And so language access is a very significant barrier to participation. There are other barriers to voting that are worth at least mentioning. Having a requirement that you vote in person on a work day is also a significant barrier to voting. So there's just many examples of that. So that's just one of them. And then you get to issues like gerrymandering, and perhaps leading to the view that voting doesn't matter because of gerrymandering. That's also, so I can say more about this and give more examples, but in order to sort of not hog the mic too long. I just want to say that civic participation is manifested in many respects through voting, and that there have been historical practices that are methods of excluding people from civic participation and voting. Some of them are express ineligibility criteria, but others are ones like barriers to voting, like language, barriers to the effectiveness of voting, like gerrymandering, and I think that that's a way to think about what is it that has kept people from voting. You can give people the vote in a formal and technical eligibility sense, but you can actually, if decision makers are so inclined, make it really hard for people to actually vote and really retard the participation rate, and that can be done because you don't think the vote, because decision makers don't think the vote is valuable. It can be done to target certain communities by language or race or by gender or by class.
And I think that this is really important, and I want to get back to the historical context before we move to the present. So there were a number of governmental decisions and actions in this country as it related to the ballot box and participating electorally. One of those, as I mentioned, was Reconstruction, that then gave way to Jim Crow. And to Professor Motomura's example of poll taxes, there were literacy tests. Ultimately, to Cynthia and Professor Motomura's examples, civic engagement occurred outside of the ballot box for access to the ballot box. This was detailed in the women's suffrage movement. This was detailed in the civil rights. But ultimately, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 really engendered a new way for people to participate equally, so be it that they were citizens and over the age of 18 across the country. Now, that still didn't have the narrow tailoring to some immigrant Americans because of the racial categories. And so for Latinos as an ethnic group, their ability to access civil rights really had to come down to courts, federal courts, identifying them as a racial group. Now, for Asian Americans, was really thinking through how there was access to in-language ballot materials and educational materials. That didn't come until the 1970s. And in that way, that provided a wide swath of Asian American and Latinos in this country that were immigrant and limited English proficient access to the ballot box. Now, how has that translated in the state of California, both at the state level and then local municipal, in terms of meetings and translation services, or in the era of the present, COVID-19, and how people are able to engage on a Zoom or digital platform? Cynthia, I'd love to hear about what civic engagement looks like for limited English proficient immigrants in the state.
It's an interesting question because I was just at a conference last year on the issue of language access, especially in the healthcare space, right? Certainly, I think we're one of the, I don't have the names of the bills and the laws that we pass on this, but what I can say to you is that we're one of the states that have devoted resources in making sure that language justice becomes even more expansive for our very linguistically diverse state. We have more than 200 dialects in California, and we're only translating about a quarter of those dialects into materials, documents, platforms, and formats that people can access. So it continues to be a challenge, even now in the work that we do at CAPC. That is the constant feedback that we're getting, is that within immigrant communities, we are not very aware that this particular community, as well as refugee communities, it's very linguistically diverse. For example, Black immigrants are constantly lumped together as though they only speak French Creole as the other language they speak other than English. So this is a conversation that we're now having within CIPC as well as advocates about how can we really unpack this issue of language justice that's not just focused on particular ethnic groups, but naming the big problem coming up with a big framework and vision, and really identifying how can we both not just create a robust language justice infrastructure, but evolve. Because you pointed out the pandemic, and that's a very, very specific example of how we failed many communities from participating even in decisions and issues that have impact on their life and their well-being, because telehealth is mostly conducted in English. Or if you're lucky, you'll have Spanish translation, right? And a lot of our documents, medical documents, they are only bilingual. There are agencies, of course, where you can see 5 or 7 languages that are translated, like Hmong, Vietnamese, Thai, Tagalog, or Filipino, or Khmer. But again, it still does not reflect the immense diversity of our state. And you can only imagine who are being excluded by the continuing challenges in our language justice issues in California. So this is a subject matter that is far from settled. And I believe that we could do more, we could do better, but we need to work better together, because we are still very siloed. Both state agencies, county governments, and advocates are still very much siloed in how they look at language justice issues writ large.
Thank you, Professor Motomura. I know you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, just want to name something that I think very, very much part of our, was very important part of our saying, and that is, I think historically, that even when the participation is a sideline inclusion, in other words, we do not accept membership, and they want to even when.
Professor, I'm going to interrupt you because your sound is a little garbled.
Okay. I hope this is clear there. I think even when the participation is a sideline inclusion, in other words, that try to use it and membership as a sideline participation. Historically, their ways that participation has been sideline inclusion. And I think the unfortunate way in a lot of cases, the participation is in some sense a little that as those older ones get, if you have participated and decided by somebody, you were English, you've done certain things, that then you get this reward of access to ballot or other concepts of participation.
Professor, I'm going to interject again and segue for you to look at the chat, and then I'm going to do some filler with Cynthia right now.
Okay.
Everybody on the audience to please ask questions so that I can integrate your critical kind of analysis, your interest in the humanistic perspective of electoral politics and civic engagement. One of the things that I was thinking about here, and Cynthia, you brought it up, which was COVID and the ways in which our relief and recovery at all levels, whether under the Trump or Biden administrations or under our governor or under our state and locality, municipal governments, there were exclusions based on categories. And some of these categories were around whether or not someone had someone without a social security number on their tax reform. That made them ineligible for the CARES Act. Other categories were whether or not someone had internet access and was in language to get the vaccine and figure out a web portal. So these were all very purposeful. And we know that. And Professor Motomura talked about inclusion and exclusion. Can you talk to us, Cynthia, a little bit about what the state of California is doing around inclusion? There's been a lot, and this has come on the backs of the radical self-determination, the conscientious attempts on behalf of leaders to continue to fight for equity, whether this is being included in the healthcare system during a global pandemic, or it's around being able to afford, food and housing and that type of relief.
Absolutely. Yeah, certainly. Just very quickly on the pandemic related issue. we were part of the vaccine advisory committee at the state level when the response was launched, and those issues that you pointed out were very much prevalent, even including pharmacies asking for IDs when it was already made very clear that people can just go in there and they don't have to provide, they can show something else, but not like an ID requirement. So talking about a more inclusive state infrastructure at this point, what has really changed in the last, I'd say, at the tail end of the Brown administration and at the beginning of the Newsom administration, is this idea of for all. And that the notion of for all is actually a good messaging framework, because it doesn't even mention immigrants, but it resonates a lot with, of course, we want this for everybody. Who doesn't want everybody to be healthy? Who doesn't want people to have food on their stomach, on their table? So in terms of I consider it now the great movement towards inclusion. We are now going to be the first state in the country to provide comprehensive healthcare, comprehensive medical to undocumented immigrants, regardless of status. When I say all, it's now everybody, all the age range, from children to all the remaining age categories. We are also in the process of addressing some of the gaps in the California Food Assistance Program through the Food for All campaign, where we're going to gradually make sure that the system allows for greater compassion and inclusivity by including immigrants regardless of immigration status. There is a campaign going on right now called the Safety Net for All, which will attempt to provide unemployment insurance to undocumented immigrant workers who lose their job during the pandemic or even in any number of conditions. We already provide in the state budget somewhere between $75 million a year for many immigrant families who need legal assistance as they fight their cases in court. So why am I citing all of these examples? Because at CIPC and with our partners, we believe that unless we address the fundamental human development needs of immigrants, it will continue to be a barrier to civic participation. When you are worried about food, when you're worried about becoming bankrupt because you don't have access to healthcare, you're not thinking so much about voter engagement. You're not thinking so much about participating in political processes in your community. So there is a correlation between creating a strong fabric of social safety nets as well as engaging in our democracy that is very, very important to point out here.
And thank you for that, Cynthia. Professor, thanks for coming back. I'm gonna throw a question to you. So Cynthia brought up California's modern contemporary approach of a California for all. I would posit that this is a type of universalism and a way to engage all categories of citizenship. Now, there isn't a precision there in terms of equity, so I'm just gonna put that there. Now, in terms of the modern era and the lack of comprehensive immigration reform and the abundance of different types of policies in and outside of immigration law that seek to categorize immigrants, whether this is Daca, this is temporary protected status holders, these are green card holders. Can you talk about how civic engagement and these categories looks? Like, what does civic engagement for a Daca resident look like or recipient look like versus those that are ineligible because of the year that they were born? And then similarly, thinking about TPS status as those that are coming from countries with large Latino populations or the Black diaspora. There's just so much going on here, but it all implicates their ability to participate as citizens in what we call American democracy.
Yeah, and I apologize for the whatever technical difficulties are going on. Can you hear me okay this time around? Okay. Yeah, so immigration status is one key determinant of participation. And I think that at one end of the spectrum, we have citizens with voting rights, but we also have people who have precarious immigration statuses. And so, we talked earlier about non-citizen voting. And including people who are not citizens. The actual participation rates are are low. And I think one of the reasons why they're low is that I haven't done a poll on this, but I suspect one of the reasons they're low is that there's a threat of immigration enforcement, or a sense that people's legal status is precarious enough that maybe they don't want to be on the government radar for potential if their TPS expires or anything like that. So this goes back to what Cynthia was saying about priorities, and it's very hard to get people or to expect people to be civically engaged if they face other things as threats. And one of them is economic, but the other is a threat of enforcement. And I think enforcement is very closely tied, of course, to immigration status. And it's also, this is a bit of a tension between, what states can do and what the federal government can do, because California has done quite a bit to include people regardless of immigration status. But those who are included by California policy, but who under federal law have precarious immigration status or no immigration status at all, are going to find it hard to participate fully, and certainly going to find it hard to do things like voting.
And I appreciate that sentiment in that, enforcement is an issue. Does that reflect the turnout gap? Literature suggests no, but I will say anecdotally, I was on a presidential campaign 6 years ago, and in Virginia, when I was doing voter suppression, there was a sign outside of a polling booth essentially telling people that if they were immigrant, they could not vote. Yeah. And so these types of things still persist in many ways as a result of our vacuum as it relates to leadership are likely proliferating. So I want to, again, encourage audience members to ask questions, but I want to really get to something that I think is important. I grew up in California in the 1990s at a point where there was both suppressive policymaking that in many ways was a direct line to the Trump administration. Many could argue that English only, Proposition 187, a ban on affirmative action, 3 strikes really were Stephen Miller's kind of playbook along with Mitch McConnell. Now, going back outside of that, and I'm cognizant of the history, the political framework, and this idea of us versus them, illegal. Talk about the legality of participating in whether or not a child is able to be in an advanced placement class in their local high school, or the legality of an immigrant family asking for a stop sign in their neighborhood, or the legality of dreamers stepping into congressional offices, asking for them to be noticed and for their future to actually have an avenue for future thinking. Just like, it's just a concept that I've been thinking about because that's civic engagement.
Right, and that's certainly civic engagement that is not directly related to voting eligibility. It has to do with a sense of empowerment of agencies, they say, and those are all just very important. And so what I was saying earlier, by the way, about enforcement threat retarding voter participation rates. I mean, I fully take the point that voting, it's not all just about voting, it's about these other things. But let me sort of take your question in a way that I think is faithful to answer it, but it's also kind of put this in perspective. This is all a set of expectations that society has and that people have sort of because they live in a society that sets these expectations. I mean, the reason that people are often enabled to participate and do politically participate is that is the expectation they have for themselves, and that expectation comes, I think, from people. I think one of the biggest effects of Daca has been actually to sort of create a group of people who feel empowered by that status and who can mobilize politically on that basis. And that's kind of a self-expectation. I also think that societies can have these expectations. One of the most interesting things about this whole, the history of this is, non-citizens were allowed to vote for much of US history. And for a period from about 1850, very common from 1850 to about the 1920s. And the reason people were allowed to vote in this period is that typically people were allowed to vote if they filed a declaration of intent to become a citizen. And then they were treated just like citizens, even though they weren't citizens yet. And so if you came in, if you filed these papers the day after you arrived in the United States to become a citizen, at some time in the future, you could start voting right away. Now, here's what's interesting about this. That reflected expectation. This is why I've mentioned expectations of those individuals that they were supposed to participate, and an expectation of the society that we were expected to vote. But here's the catch. The only people who are eligible to become citizens, that was very racially restricted. And so Asian immigrants were not included in this category. So this was a favorable treatment of largely white Europeans expected to vote and allowed to vote. It's an example of the larger frame in which people are mobilizing now. It's partly legal recognition, but it's also a sense of who is actually going to be American in the future. And so I think what I'm seeing is when you get political mobilization, you're also seeing kind of an awareness that DACA recipients, for example, by not being citizens, can't vote, but they can mobilize, and voting and full participation is in their future.
Lead political campaigns. I'm going to bring in a question from Philip in the chat about philanthropy, but I am going to narrow it for you, Cynthia, which is that as we see the state and the country grow in population, albeit not at the same rate as prior decades, it's on the back of Asian and Latino communities. Now, these communities are similar in that they're fast growing, but they're also youthful, meaning that they're going to be aging into the electorate. That's in opposite to non-Hispanic whites who are aging and not reproducing in a positive birth rate. So the question from Philip is, what's the role of philanthropy? My question for you, Cynthia, is what's the role of philanthropy in closing the racial ethnic turnout gap?
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to just first say that if we had our wits about us, we would fully understand that demography is destiny, and that demographic diversity is such a key factor in progress, right? Certainly, there has been over time many efforts by philanthropy to resource civic engagement programming within the social change movement. And when I say social change, I am casting a big net around that. This includes groups like California Calls, for example, CHIRLA, the Million Voter Project. And now there are new nascent organizations that are coming up to especially look at the particularity of these two voting blocks that have actually the great potential to be a powerful political player, but for so many barriers that still exist. I think in the last, I'd say 6 years, especially since Donald Trump was elected, there was a sea change in grant making from philanthropy, where increased resources have been dedicated not only to providing funding for 501c4 organizing and infrastructure building, but also funding organizing work as it relates to civic engagement. I, as a grantee, and I'm familiar with a lot of our partner organizations as well as funders, we are seeing a diversification in grant making that is geared towards making sure that groups like California Calls, who actually do a lot of work, not just voter engagement, not just voter education, but predictive work around where voter attitudes are going so that we can create a 10-year plan around civic participation. Resources are being spent there. Is it enough? I can't say, because we're not an organization that does direct civic engagement work, but I think that what would actually really scale this and bring greater momentum to this development is for state and philanthropic partnership to look at where are the gaps still. Why are certain particular ethnic groups within API and Latino communities such low propensity voters? You just look at city elections and like city council elections, and it's like there was one election where the South Korean community 5% voted. When you look at the numbers that's produced, say, by the Equity Research Institute, where there's 23 million immigrants, or 10% of eligible voters are eligible to vote in California. So it's what is the, sorry, not in California, but are eligible voters. So I'm just saying that there's always room to improve some of the things that we're doing, as well as making sure that philanthropy continues to go in this direction of really recognizing that civic participation is as important as all the other grant making priorities that they have.
And thanks for Cynthia. And I want to respond to Philip's question. And then I also want to provide an opportunity for the professor to chime in around this demography idea. In terms of Philip's question, philanthropy has a role to play so long as philanthropy is pressuring and emboldening civic participation amongst frontline communities. And so in a state like California that is not restricting ballot access per se, this decade, instead looking at franchise expansion, whether this is automatic vote by mail, which is universal after COVID-19, or vote centers, there's still a structural dimension of politics in the ballot. And that structural dimension is that there are finite resources amongst campaigns, meaning that they are going to focus on likely voters who tend to be more mature, meaning older, and whiter and more affluent. And so as we see California's demographics translate to electoral change in that demography, there's a need for those newly eligible or low propensity voters to receive permissible voter education about how to cast a ballot and how to really understand the myriad of questions that exist on a California ballot. It is not a simple ballot for anybody. And so thinking through what type of educational opportunities and other types of innovations can government put at this time of exceptional, tremendous surplus, if we really want to fight for an inclusive democracy. Now, Cynthia, as you mentioned, demography is not destiny. Part of American history is that the numbers until the middle part of this country have really been such that there were more enslaved and indigenous people on this land than there were white colonial settlers, and yet power remains in white supremacy. And we're at a place where non-Hispanic whites are still the largest racial ethnic group, but we know that the nation is transforming into a majority minority nation. Yet with this white supremacy type of policy stance about who can vote, how they can vote, who can show up in public places, what people can learn in public schools, it almost doesn't matter that the numbers are changing because the power remains. And so for you, Professor Motomura, what do you make of this idea that demography or demographics are destiny?
Well, a couple different layers in this. I mean, one is the barriers that we're talking about, right? That if you have barriers to participation, then demography, the power of demography is going to be diminished. The other thing is it's not just about barriers, it's also the feeling of inclusion. There are many people who are immigrants to this country who feel that they are not part of this country. This is partly rooted in history. It's partly rooted in the images that we see on television. It's in the expectations. I know when my parents came to this country, they really didn't feel that, voting was for them, at least for a while, because there's this idea that this country was not one, at least at the time, where Asian American immigrants had just become actually eligible to even become U.S. citizens at that back then. Okay. The third thing, which I think is just a danger flag on the horizon that also mitigates or reduces the impact of demography, is there's a movement out there to stop counting people. We certainly saw this in the citizenship litigation, in trying to ask citizenship questions during the Trump administration and the census, which would retard the response rate. But more importantly, or at least as importantly, is there's a movement afoot to try to not count people unless they're citizens, not count them for purposes of legislative redistricting in some situations. And so that's another. So what we're seeing, I think, is are several different attempts to hold back the impact or resist the impact of demographic change. And I think that those call for vigilance.
And I want to give Cynthia, you a chance to respond, because I think that this is really important, right? So demographics can be destiny so long as there is an enumeration that's accurate. Demographics can be destiny so long as there is access, meaningful opportunity. Demographics can be destiny so long as there's inclusion and equity, not just diversity, right? That we're remedying that underrepresentation. What does full engagement and political voice look like for you, Cynthia?
I think it is, of course, the opposite of what you said. Like, is there a way for us, to the extent that we can build on the successful models of quote unquote state citizenship or federalism, as it were, in California and in other states? We're not the only one who is trying to initiate this transformative engagement with immigrant communities. As I say, I think I said earlier, New York, Illinois, Washington State, many parts of the East Coast are building on some of these gains around immigrant engagement to remove these barriers. We have some real headwinds against us. Not only these our adversaries in policymaking increasing, including where the Supreme Court's framework is headed, but also if you look at just a report by the Brennan Center in May, there's hundreds of new election interference laws that are being now either enacted or being proposed in different parts of the country. So we need to have the ability not only to, it's the both and mentality that you probably have heard already about. How can we increase and keep the momentum in progressive states where immigrants and refugees are being catalyzed to be powerful voting blocs, with places where nary an infrastructure exists? So if we can't do that, then it's going to be really not only very slow, but we may even experience some setbacks, especially if these election interference laws succeed, if many of these succeed. So courts, of course, will be important, but so is our ability to create a firewall for our policies that are already in place, and make sure that they are not taken away. Because if that's where to happen, then we will be dreaming demography is destiny for a long time.
Yeah, and that's interesting because as you say that in terms of things being taken away, and Professor Motomura, you alluded to this, there are challenges now to whether or not immigrant children and undocumented children can receive public education in this country, and that was long settled. We obviously saw the attack on abortion that was prolonged and successful for those who wanted to disband access. The and strategy is really important because LPPI just released a report, and that's the Latino Policy and Politics Institute, about gubernatorial and executive appointments in the state of California. And there is not public data, so it makes it difficult for accountability. But what the researchers found was that Latinos had the largest representational gap. And so this is at a time when we're still in, expanding who gets to serve, right? Both in government and then in the private sector. The state legislature said that companies that are based in the state of California need to have a diversity requirement. We know that there are more people of color who are ready and willing to serve, yet there are these draconian kind of structural issues, even in a state like California. And so, Cynthia, as you were mentioning the research out of the Brennan Center and the all-out assault on democracy, I think about the Arizona state legislature who wanted to take a state's total vote count and give it to a board of electors to whether to approve or not. And so this would be, individuals selective. And if it looks anything like the research that we just did in the state of California, you can imagine what that body would be composed of. And so as we close out, Professor Motomura, I want you to just kind of talk about this idea of setbacks. Like, we have to be realistic. We've been living in chaos. We're living in historic times. This country is very young compared to other countries, but our democracy is in a state that is novel, I think, for a lot of people, but also in a global setting where we're seeing a rise of authoritarianism. And we're also seeing a rise of xenophobia. tell us what you're thinking about how law and policy is really shaping citizenship.
That's of course, a huge question that I'm not sure I can resolve in a couple of minutes. But I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure. What the future holds. I'm not sure anyone does. But I think it's worth naming. This is the point I was trying to make back when I had the technical glitch a few minutes ago. But what I really fear here is that it's a struggle between two different ways to think about political participation. I think that the movement that we're seeing, and I can give examples of this, but the movement, a lot of what we're seeing in trying to limit participation, make it harder to vote, are people who believe that civic participation is a reward to be given to the few, reluctantly given in many cases. You have to really prove yourself in many ways that include, in some cases, having financial means. That's one way of, and that's what I fear is really coming up. This is people say, well, if people really want to vote, they would do X, Y, and Z. And the fact is, there are people who really want to vote who don't have the means to do X, Y, and Z. But that's one way of thinking about it. And this is what I'm really concerned about. And the other way to think about it, and I think it's been running through this entire conversation, but I want to name it, is that civic participation isn't a reward. It's a vehicle for inclusion and building a stronger society. You build a stronger society by broadening representation. You build a stronger society by broadening input. You build a stronger society by bringing people in and taking advantage of what they have to offer, and you give them opportunity to contribute, basically. And I think that that's really what's behind civic participation. And Sonia, you mentioned also education as being under threat. I mean, there's been some intimations that some states would go after the constitutional principle that children go to school regardless of their immigration law status. Well, this is a good example of this. I mean, the reason we send kids to school is because they can participate in society in a full and inclusive way. If you were to look at education as some reward that you give reluctantly to a few, then what kind of society we're going to have? And that's the way I think about civic participation. That's what I think is at stake here. And that's a way to think about voting and education and inclusion as examples of inclusion. But that's really what we're talking about. And counting people is an important part of this as well.
I want to close by asking both of you a question in terms of what gives you hope.
Well, I think a lot of things actually, even in this moment, give me hope. And I think it's because I think people understand some of these things I think we've been talking about in this session about really trying to build a stronger society in which people can really contribute not just to society, but also to their own growth. I think that if I look at some of the composition of the Supreme Court and decisions they're making, then that's not something that gives me hope. But I know that there are a lot of good people, millions, hundreds of millions of people, not just in the United States, but around the world, but who really do believe in an inclusive and participatory society. And that gives me hope because I think over time, that's what really matters. And I think history has borne that out.
Yes, proceeding with a glass half full mentality. I'm hopeful that so many, not just immigrants, so many communities of color and people who are with us in this notion of an inclusive society realize that so much has changed in the last almost 3 years. Let's say even 6 years under the Trump administration, and that we cannot go back to the way things were. So we need to grow a new muscle in how we tackle the changes that we want to make. So what are the critical opportunities we're going to make out of this crisis? I am excited about what happened in Kansas, that there are segments in our society that will not just take things sitting down. So it would be great to capitalize on some of those energy that may not still be being harnessed in the right direction. We have to have the ability to do that. Look at these muscles that are being grown and how we harness that into a great new social movement.
I appreciate that so very much from both of you. And I want to bring in Kirsten Vega. And I think that you can think through California Humanities as a muscle, because humanity is really thinking about human dignity and not just qualifying it as it relates to numbers or it relates to dollars. So Kirsten, thank you so much for having us and providing this platform. I'm going to turn it to you.
Oh, thanks, Sonia. And thank you so much, Cynthia and Hiroshi. This conversation has been incredibly informative for us. And the way you've been able to share your expertise to reveal the very complicated anatomy of these issues, the emergent quality of this conversation is just going to be a great resource for our listeners going forward. So sincere thank you for joining us. I just want to say a few things before we close. One is that we have recorded this session, so we will be posting it on YouTube, sharing it with the email list who RSVP'd. Another is that we have one more California on the Ballot program coming up this season. I hope some of you can make it. The topic will be voting rights for Indigenous populations in California and getting some firsthand takes on what civic participation looks like in those communities. I would also like to thank my wonderful colleagues who have helped me so much with this program. Stephen Loskatoff behind the scenes doing all of our Zoom tech, Julie Fry, our ever supportive president and CEO who helped to develop this program and this series, as well as to all of the staff at California Humanities who had a part in playing out this program. So we'll have links in the chat for those of you who'd like to RSVP for our next, but once again, thank you so much, Sonia, Cynthia, Hiroshi. We are greatly appreciative of your time tonight.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay safe.